Wonderful. I mean, what an exciting conversation. And I mean, so many difficult questions to ponder. And I certainly concur. We need to spend more time talking and thinking about these ideas, insofar as maybe, even as Meg Wheatley always says, even a good conversation is potentially changing the affordances and the potentiality of our times. It seems our minds are always occupied into just one direction. But of course, this is the final section of our call. We've asked you before to step into the role of a student, of a listener to the presentation that Christian gave us, then into the footsteps of the practitioner to figure out whether you could help Christian practically or you could apply some of that in your own life. And now what we want you to do is to kind of don your lab coats and step into the role of scientists. We now want to look at the ECG from the vantage point maybe of the kind of the scientist who seeks to categorize a specimen, first in the context of everything we already know, the theories that we have, and then we want to look at the specificities of the specimen under our kind of examination, and see if finally we can extract some insights, golden nuggets, and essentials that we can take forward on our journey towards all these other paradigms that we have on our bandwagon. And today we're going to try to do that for the very first time, so please bear with us. It's still all draft. We will do two things. One, we want to categorize the ECG as a system, as Christian says, it's an overarching system. And then we want to briefly dive into the three sections, which you know by now, the ideals, the institutions, and the transformation approach, and see if we can compare it to things we already know. And here I want to start with this very kind of complicated but not so complicated slide. It's basically the generic flows in an economy, right? You can see roughly the flows that regards to the resources that go to the businesses produce goods and services to make a profit, and then the private economy, you see it interact there with both the government and the financial sector. You also see the flows that are maximized in green, exactly as Christian said. So you have the flows that move to profit in green, and the costs that relate to the activities, to the economic activities in red. And clearly the most important outcome in capitalism is private wealth. Indeed, we were talking about economics as the science of pleasure at the beginning, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, and later turned into mostly a science of wealth. And now if we take this macro level framework, we can also highlight some of the crises that we are interested in on this call. Because, of course, our assumption is that some of these typical flows in capitalism generate meta issues, as Christian pointed out. So here again, a reminder of the crisis of capitalism as described by Paul Adler in his very interesting book, The 99% Economy. And maybe we can even distinguish primary crises that directly relate to these flows. And you can see these lighter orange secondary crises, which are things that will really bite us in the longer term. Now, let's say this is a summary, abstract view of the economy as it runs. Now the question is, where's the ECG? And here, Christian said it, he doesn't want to go there, but we will touch on the socialism point. So again, a 60-second question to everybody in the audience. What is socialism? I mean, as Christian pointed out, so whenever you start to talk about non-capitalism, you immediately being put into the socialist corner, which might or might not be accurate. But if you ask yourself, what are the 5 characteristics of socialism, what would you believe has to be included? What are the most relevant aspects of socialism? If you think about who was Bernie Sanders in the US, or some of the very left-wing politicians here in the UK, well, what are they standing for? Any thoughts? I'll give it a few seconds. State-led, yeah. It's not so easy, is it? I think with capitalism, we had a few ideas and many people had some thoughts. Socialism seems to be almost a bad word that is being used just to highlight everyone who's not on the capitalist side. What is socialism is the wrong question. Social ownership. I won't harass you for long. I will go to Antoinette, our researcher, for answers. But it's just a recognition of social value. It's just interesting that it's not entirely clear, or not as clear as it maybe could be. Planning, Antoinette, over to you.
I mean, for an economist, that's not an easy one. And my biggest insight was, of course, that socialism is clearly different from communism. I mean, they both share the idea of social equality and the emphasis on community and cooperation instead of competition. But even the lefties in socialism are fervent democrats and want collective decision-making. Of course, not an authoritarian one-party state. And socialists want relative, no total social and economic equality. They often might opt for social welfare and social reforms instead of a classless society, which is the ultimate aim of communism. And they often rather want to humanize capitalism rather than to abolish it completely. But you can already see it's a broad church, this socialism. So here, just some ideas for you to make sense of it.
So maybe not a surprise that it's not so clear, right? But you can see it is starting with social welfare. Clearly, there's a property element, etc. So, by the way, why are we giving you all these little glossary entries? Because on this call, we have, as Kees pointed out at the beginning, we got activists, we got academics, and we got practitioners. And we need to make sure that we're establishing a degree of common language, because otherwise, using these terms, which are very often loaded emotionally or loaded ideologically, we will talk across each other all the time. So I think we need to just make sure that we are getting clarity, or at least agree how we will use some of these terms on these calls. But now that we have defined it, we will suggest that when we look at the ECG, we're finding lots of elements that are quite typical in a socialist textbook. So if you look at, in red, the economic interventions, which cover things that relate to restrictions in production, or the property required, the means of production, as well as the nature of the ownership of the enterprises, as well as, you see it there in terms of financial flows, restriction on interest rates or commercial bank money. And you also find on the regulatory side some similarities. Christian is very passionate about inheritance tax, for example, if you read his book. There's certainly progressive taxation. Christian is also an advocate for UBI, universal basic income. And of course, there's social welfare. And there's a lot of regulation that is about equality of wealth and power. But there are certainly a number of elements, and I think Christian has highlighted that, where the ECG is bringing in some interesting flavors that build on top of this. And clearly one aspect is this very radical democratization. And one thing that I think took us all by surprise, we're going to go there, is the aspects of financial services democratization. But the other thing is, of course, the preeminence of the common good product, which takes over the role of private wealth or profit as the final goal. As Christian said, we're mistaking the means with the end, so the end becomes the common good product. But I think it might be quite helpful to use such a schema in the ongoing discussion of the different frameworks that we will encounter to see, okay, in a nutshell, right, what are the most important interventions that people advocate for, and can we compare? But now we want to go to the level underneath. So let me go and take you now into a few complicated slides that might help you to understand where we're going. What we want to do with each of these slides is give you an overview of what the options are. So firstly, on political ideologies. In modern democracies, we normally find flavors of those four quadrants that you see on the right-hand side. And it's quite interesting to look at where they come from and how they differ. Most modern ideologies are grounded in some sort of natural or divine law absolutism, which you can see under the A starting point on the right. Human or basic rights were often derived from God's will. And this opens up the original political divide, which is under the letter B in the 18th century between conservatives on the one hand and the so-called classical liberals on the others. And classical liberals demanded above all freedom, which becomes the bedrock of modern politics. It's about personal freedom, individual freedom. And they especially argued for what was called negative freedom, which is freedom from coercion or interference. And of course, in that original political discussion, that was especially against clergy, feudal lords, aristocracy. Right? In the contemporary discourse, the classical liberals become libertarians, as we know them, right? The Chicago School. And the big divide now is between those libertarians who want this so-called negative freedom and the modern liberals or the social democrats who instead of negative freedom demand greater equality and positive freedom. So the freedom, the capacities for individuals to really lead their life in society to a basic standards that we could all agree on. And of course, this leads to a demand for welfare and greater redistribution in order to make sure that people have equality of opportunity. And now if we look towards the right again, the green divide, in postmodern times, we find very often what I've called an ontological difference between the concept of a person as an unencumbered atomistic being without any history or association to what is called a communitarian ideology, which is relational and mutual. I am because you are. So the focus shifts on a we instead of just an I. And you can take this to maybe a position of a radical utopia, where the socialists on the very right-hand side take it to the us, where the state is envisaged entirely, as Antoinette pointed out, as some classless collective. And this almost brings us full circle, but it opens up the final divide. You can see that on the right-hand side, the metaphysical divide, which is socialism or communism focused mostly on material essence, so that everybody has the same property or the same rights to property or the same welfare when it comes to almost physical well-being, whereas in the original idealism, that was, of course, mostly spiritual. And either way, you can see on the side that it brings us to different viewpoints as to what the state actually is. On the right-hand side, the state is understood as the guardian of some substantial objective ideal. Whereas on the left-hand side, the state is simply a power struggle for subjective interests. And this, I think, gives us a rudimentary frame for the positioning of the ECG. And I will suggest here as my takeaway from the discussion that the ECG is somewhere between a radical democratic position, which is somewhere on the left, vis-a-vis and basing itself, as Christian pointed out, on modern liberal constitutions that all, however, entail, whatever they say, a merely procedural understanding of the common good. Right? The German constitution or the American constitution might talk about welfare, but as John Rawls will explain, it's always merely procedural. It's a maximization of individual freedoms, and any substantive common good is not really part of a liberal constitution. And therefore, it opens up a tension between what clearly is a list of specific goods on the right and what in modern kind of legitimization of states is much more a way how we interact with each other so that everybody gets to the greatest positive or negative freedom. And I think that is really a big problem in modern society, as I think Antoinette or Case pointed out at the beginning. I think Case it was, saying that we get to ever greater individualism, which moves us to the left, and maybe even to the bottom left, to this libertarian position or the conservative libertarian position. Whereas maybe in order to address some of the problems in the world today, we need to move more towards the right, getting together behind some more substantive and stronger embeddedness, as Christian showed on his slide, of individuals, and uniting people in their understanding of the changes required to all our lives. So this will be my first suggestion of a takeaway here. I think what we need to watch for in the paradigms to come is how people deal with the necessity to unite, whereas the natural inclination today, and I think also the constitutions in liberal democracies, is clearly towards the left. And with that, that's my personal takeaway. So I'm going to hand over to Antoinette, I believe, for the second. I'm going from the ideals to the institutions.
Okay. Yeah, so a little bit more on the ground, so to say. But I want to go through the same process. So first look at the different strategies to govern economy in society. And then I also try to put ECG into the picture and try to draw some insights. And I'm at the end very curious, Christian, what you are going to say towards that. So in general, what you can see here is that we have two types of approaches to economic order. The classic approach is the so-called dualist approach, where the state is responsible for the basic structure of the market. And the market is seen in general as either neutral or amoral, as an efficient allocator of scarce resources, as we all learned in our economics classes. What the state does here is it enables the market through property rights or contract laws. It regulates the market, for instance, with competition policies, and it redistributes outcomes through taxation or social welfare measures. Now, this strategy can either be minimal, and then we land with A, which is the typical neoliberal laissez-faire deregulation, where you probably only have a little bit of competition laws and, of course, the property rights. Or it can be much more expensive, as in social democracy and modern liberal regimes, which you see now in B and E, where markets are conditional to achieve broader political welfare objectives. So they're instrumental, I could also say it this way. Here the approaches can vary between their emphasis on predistribution, so this is B, which seeks to correct power imbalances and enhance worker mobility and skills prior to the market activity, or it could focus more on the redistribution side. On the other side, E, where the focus lies on the correction of market results. But in reality, you will see it, of course, mixed. Now, the second approach views markets as immoral, or at least as problematic to some degree. And hence it is focused to change, coordinate, or control the market activities, also the market actors themselves. In this case, you have, for instance, here C, where institutions are deployed to empower the actors themselves, for example, by developing ethical norms and personal virtues. And through that, the market should become a more moral place to be. So what you would do here typically is education, democratical deliberation, moral suasion, moral development, just some examples. And then, of course, you also have D, where the state, or in the case of socialism, as we heard it, the public take over partially the market activities. This can happen through nationalization, through administrative prices, change in property or ownership structure. So I hope you have a little bit of this complex picture now in mind. And now I try to sort in ECG. Where would I position it? Well, first of all, Christian, not very easy, because I, of course, read your books, and I have to really say you are a whirlwind. You have so many ideas. This is really amazing. So it was not so easy to place you. But I think arguably that most of your institutional innovations can be found in D. So you alter the transactions or take transactions out of the market. That's what I saw mostly. And if I just pick three very important ones, of course, the common good matrix, which in its full-blown stage would have a binding force. And I think that would be very important in your view. And it would be subject to regular audits and would be also highly consequential. For instance, you would get better loans, or you get tax reductions and all the kind of things you thought about. But that, in a sense, is also a certain type of surveillance. So you really want to make sure that companies are behaving in the common good matrix type of way. The second thing, which I also find a very strong feature of your ideas, is that you want to strongly regulate the financial market. Because, of course, you want to make sure that profit is a means and not a goal any longer. And what you say here, just that people get some ideas, is that you say we have to regulate the use of profits, we have to prohibit investments outside the real industry, we should have loans for those companies which are really common good companies, they should have it cheaper, we should prohibit dividends, interest rates, hostile takeover, so a whole bunch, but again, quite regulatory, quite surveillant. And then, of course, and that was already something that people discussed, is very interesting property regimes. So you have some limitations of private property for relative economic equality. You have clearly the ideal of mixed ownership of companies, And then the also very interesting part is the democratic commons, where important needs covering industries and banks should be ruled by elected representatives of the government, employees, customers, gender equality officers, and environmental ombudspeople. So I picked these. Of course, you also have this very, very strong democratic thread. And in that sense, I believe that is a little bit more into C, where you say we need also the civic education so people can have this great capacity for deliberations. But I didn't saw that very strongly. So for me, the takeaway here, or it's not a takeaway, for me, it's more questions. So I would have this question, and I think it was also in the chat, is it possible to have these very far-reaching reforms, which ultimately you also want to bring through democratic deliberation without having a much, much stronger focus on individual, moral, ethical development? Here I was kind of thinking maybe you need a much stronger development and, as Case would say, inner freedom aspect in addition to what you are suggesting. And maybe a last one, this is just because I'm Swiss and because we talked to Paul Adler. You have also a certain, it's more of a closed and regulated economy in mind. And what Paul Adler told us, for that, of course, you would ideally need a big market. So Germany is probably good enough for that. America is even better. It's not going to happen in America, but maybe in Germany at some stage. But at the same time, if you want to have an active democracy, a direct democracy, then small is beautiful. So that's another one where I'm kind of struggling how to bring that together.
Very exciting, very interesting. Thank you very much, Antoinette. And Case, over to you for the transformation and change part.
So there are a bunch of different narratives when it comes to capitalism. So when you look on the left, you see the market-based, conscious or green capitalism discourse, which emphasizes market and technology solutions to fix our current challenges. And then to the right of that is we see the reformist narrative, which is mainly pushing for sustainability, leveraging existing institutional revolutionary measures. And from there, we can see the green narrative, the social green, red progressive narrative, which promotes the responsibility of individual citizens and local community engagements, as well as social enterprises and social enterprising. And then finally, we see the red, which is the radical and revolutionary discourse, which seeks collective mobilization in resistance or counterculture or counterposition to the existing order, which is really the revolutionary bit. And each of these discourses, of course, have their own peculiarities, and each of them will require different amounts of power to achieve their job objectives. And again, as we're pressing for time, I would like to focus on this one. And I see ECG and Thomas very, very clearly in the social green economy narrative. So I think it's based upon the participatory element of citizens taking an active role in creating their system, and it demands collective behavior where people become civic agents in change. So and I'm quite fond of this narrative. I really believe that there is a lot of potential in there, although a lot of people think that the revolutionary narrative has the most potential, but I really believe that the green one is very fruitful.
I see a bit of the ECG approach in all four, which mirrors the holistic character of the ECG. equally, I'm not happy to be adscribed to B only with, sorry, to C only with a bit of D, Antoinette. I also identify a lot with B. And so my summary would be different. My summary would not being adscribed economy to the common good to the green bubble here or to the C section in Antoinette's overview, or in Otti's scheme. I would make a totally different summary, a post-dualistic and a really holistic summary, which would mean that in Antoinette's scheme, I feel almost equally attracted to B, C, and D. That's first. But for the markets that we try to transform from capitalistic into ethical markets, I would use Otti's scheme to stretch the balance between individual human liberty and dignity with these social values, with the common good. None of the two should become dominant, because in the moment it becomes dominant, we get capitalism or socialism.
Perfect.
Impossible summary, but an attempt.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Christian. And I think someone suggested political science is all about who gets what and says who. And I think we always have to be careful when we talk about rebalancing, then says who, right? What we find as balanced, someone else might find very unbalanced. And we're back to the kind of Berlin Isaiah's necessity for pluralism in this world. And then the question is, how do we get to the common good that we all want? But we have to leave it here. And again, I want to thank Christian for all these very inspirational thoughts, and invite everybody to go to the website and see the summaries, the resources, the questions, if Christian finds time to answer them, as well as some of the comments from you all from the chat. And I just want to, in the last minute, give you a glimpse of what's coming next. And I'm going to, as usual, hand over to Kees to give us a few insights.
Yeah, so our travel, so you on the website you can find all sorts of information about Christian's books and the ECG and all that, and also about a lot of our upcoming guests. So we every month we will invite a new economic thinker to be in our midst, to have a dialogue and to dive deeper into its theory or philosophy. And next time in May we're going to do a slightly different route, because we're inviting Alex Edmonds then, and Alex is well, to put it mildly, a bit of a poster child of new economics. So he's making a lot of he made a lot of rumor with his book Grow the Pie, wherein he takes a really interesting perspective on growth. So growth, economic growth, is highly critiqued in many cases for very valid reasons. But Alex has a very different approach on growth, which you could say boils down to an integral growth. So he will be our guest in May 21st, around the same time as we have met now. Well, I really hope you'll be part of this to dive deeper and to find the potentials of alternative out there for capitalism.
Wonderful. And with that, we've come to the end of yet another edition of Reinventing Capitalism and Business for Humanity. And thanks to everybody who was with us. We hope that we will see you again soon, and that together, as Christian pointed out, we can try to make the world, and especially the world of the economics, a little bit more exciting, a little bit more humane, a little bit more solidaric over the months to come. Thank you very much indeed, and see you all